Good morning, friends. Good morning, Mrs. Moon. Okay, last time we got started with The Littles, that storybook from when I was a second grader about. Oh, my word. It's fun, isn't it? The Littles. We know that they are small and they have tails. And they live inside the walls of the Biggs family. Now, the Biggs family went on a vacation and they rented their house out to a different family. So now the Newcombs are there. And they've just got there. The Littles they're not sure how it's going to go because they know how to live with the Biggs in the house. But they're a little worried about the Newcombs. Maybe they're different. Maybe it'll be harder. So here we go. Chapter 4. A week had passed. Uncle Pete thought it was a bad beginning. Looks as though Newcomb means what he says. The place is a mess since he came. He pushed his plate away and threw down his napkin. And I am getting tired of hamburger. No matter, said Mr. Little. It'll be over one day and the Biggs will return, no harm done. Something bad will come out of it, you'll see, said Uncle Pete. Well, at least they don't have a cat, said Lucy Little. That's right, said Mrs. Little. She smiled at her family. Lucy is looking on the bright side. Things could be worse. Bah, said Uncle Pete. Right now, I'd rather have trouble with a cat than eat this cooking. Uncle Pete doesn't like the Newcombs cooking, huh? He thinks the Biggs make better food. I suppose I should have learned to cook, said Mrs. Little. She looked around the table. Mrs. Big was such a good cook, it didn't seem necessary for me to cook too. I guess she spoiled us. All the Littles nodded. Suddenly Granny Little spoke. Watch out for mice. Why did you say that, Granny? Said Mr. Little. There are no mice in this house. George Big wouldn't stand for it. Granny Little looked sharply at Mr. Little. There will be mice, she said. Then she straightened the shawl on her shoulders. Oh, don't worry, Granny, said Mr. Little. You're thinking of the old days. This is nothing like the old days. Chapter 5. All day Mrs. Newcomb worked hard at her writing. In the evening after dinner, she read what she had written to Mr. Newcomb. They sat in the living room. Sometimes Mr. Newcomb drew pictures of his wife while she was reading. The Littles became interested in the story. They would rush through their dinner so they wouldn't miss anything. The Littles' living room was in the wall next to the Biggs' living room, near the ceiling. There was a hole in the wall between the Littles' living room and the Biggs' living room. The hole was about the size of a quarter. On the Biggs' side, it was covered with wallpaper. Mr. Little had punched many tiny holes in the wallpaper. He used one of Mrs. Biggs' needles. Check it out. That's a good picture, isn't it? Voices could be heard through the tiny holes. Most of the time, the hole was plugged up with a cork on the Littles' side. As long as the cork was in the hole, no one could hear the Littles. When the cork was taken out, the Littles would be very quiet and just listen. The cork was always out when it was story time. Mrs. Newcomb's soft voice would float up through the hole. The Littles sat comfortably in their favorite chairs and listened. Sometimes Mrs. Newcomb read until it was past Lucy and Tom's bedtime. They would beg their mother to be allowed to stay up until the story was finished. Even Uncle Pete liked the readings. Wonderful story, he said, very exciting. Still, he wasn't happy with the Newcombs. The bad housekeeping, it worries me. The Newcombs were indeed bad housekeepers. Food was left around uncovered, floors were not swept after meals, garbage spilled out of the can. When the lid fell off, it wasn't put back on. All those crumbs. Mark my words, Granny said. There will be mice. One day in June, Mr. Little rushed into the living room. He slammed the door behind him. Granny was right, he said. I've been hoping it wouldn't happen, but it has. They've come. The mice are here. What can we do? Said Mrs. Little. She locked the door behind her husband. First, you, Tom, see that all the doors are locked, said Mr. Little. Tom ran to do as he was told. Mr. Little went quickly to the sofa. He pulled a chest out from under it. Don't go out alone, he said. Go armed at all times. Mr. Little opened the chest. He looked up at his wife. Who would think that this generation of Littles would have to open this weapons chest? Oh boy. swords and arrows. Mrs. Little shook her head sadly. But Father, said Lucy, I don't know how to use a bow and arrow. Uncle Pete will teach you and Tom how to shoot, said Mr. Little. He was a crack shot during the mice invasion of '35. Uncle Pete, my father, and their brothers held off the mice from this very room until help arrived from the Smalls down the road. That's when I got this limp, said Uncle Pete. A huge 3-inch mouse broke through the door and grabbed me by the foot. He dragged me out of the room. My brother Tim, God bless him, came after me and shot him. Is that when Uncle Tim lost his life? Said Tom. That's when it happened, said Uncle Pete. One of those big mice jumped him from behind. I finally chased it off with my knife, but it was too late. Uncle Pete wiped his eyes. Poor Tim. He was the only little we lost in that terrible year. We won't go looking for trouble with the mice, said Mr. Little. These weapons are for protection only. He brought out a bow with a quiver of arrows from his chest. On the wooden bow was carved, made in 1825 by Chas. B. Little. Suppose they come after us, said Tom. He picked up the bow and tried to put the string on it. Maybe they won't, said Mr. Little, as long as there's plenty to eat. I'm for going out and attacking them, said Uncle Pete. Teach them a lesson before they start to bother us. Ooh, a little scary, huh? The way I figure it, said Mr. Little, after a while the Newcombs are bound to find out they have mice. And when they do, they'll set traps and that'll be the end of it. Chapter 6. Every night for a week, Mr. Little and Tom watched the Newcombs at dinner time. Mr. Little wanted to find out if the Newcombs had seen the mice and what, if anything, they were going to do to get rid of them. Tom and his father hid high above the dinner table in a secret lookout place near the ceiling light. They could see everything that went on in the room. Below them, the Newcombs were finishing their dinner. I saw a hummingbird outside the study window today, said Mrs. Newcomb. It was feeding on the iris. Marvelous, said Mr. Newcomb. Would you mind passing the butter? That's a rare thing to see, you know. They're so tiny and timid. And fast, said Mrs. Newcomb. I moved closer to the window for a better look, and it was gone in a flash. Mr. Newcomb sipped his coffee. Dear, don't you think this coffee is a bit weak again? Mrs. Newcomb nodded. What's the bird that sounds like a rusty iron gate? Above them, the Littles listened. The Newcombs talked about many things, but as usual, neither one said anything about the mice. Let's go, said Mr. Little to Tom. They haven't seen the mice. There's the Newcombs, and there's the Littles way up top. Father and son climbed out of the lookout place. They walked across the ceiling between the rafters. Both were alarmed. Tom was carrying a bow and a quiver full of arrows. Mr. Little had a sword. He was carrying a lighted candle. What can we do? Said Tom. The Newcombs see birds everywhere outside the house, but inside where the mice are, they never see anything. Are they blind or something? Mr. Little sighed. I don't know, he said. Mice are quick animals. They're not easy to see, and they usually do most of their work when people are not around. Hey, I have an idea, said Tom Little. I know how we can get them to see the mice. How? It's easy. We can... Just then, Tom's father stopped. Tom, following close behind, bumped into him. The candle fell from Mr. Little's hand and went out. Mr. Little reached for his sword. Is it a mouse? Whispered Tom. Shh. Quietly, Tom took an arrow and fitted it into the bowstring. There was a scratching noise in the wall ahead. Mr. Little and Tom stood still and tried to see into the blackness. They listened. When Mr. Little had heard enough to know it was a mouse, he whispered to Tom, I'll stand here. You hide behind that heating pipe. As soon as the mouse reaches the top of the wall, I'll light a match. He took a deep breath. If he runs to attack me, shoot him with your bow and arrow. Don't shoot unless he attacks. The light may frighten him away. What if I miss? Said Tom. I have the sword, said Mr. Little. The mouse will have to get awfully close for you to use the sword, said Tom. That's why you'd better not miss with the arrow, said Mr. Little. Now go. Tom Little felt his way through the dark ceiling space to the pipe. He drew the arrow across the bow and pulled the string back with all his might. Then he aimed into the darkness toward the sound of the scratching. The noise grew louder and louder. From the sound of it, Tom thought the mouse was climbing near the Littles' tin can elevator. He hoped the mouse hadn't gnawed through the string. The boy had never seen a mouse. He had, of course, heard many scary stories about them. He was ready for something terrible. Suddenly there was a burst of blinding white light. His father's match. Shadows danced. Tom Little blinked. Then he saw the mouse. It was climbing up over the edge of the wall. Its eyes were like black mirrors, shining back the light of the match. Tom forgot what his father had told him. He didn't wait for the mouse to attack. Instead, as soon as he saw the beast, he shot the arrow. It flew through the air and struck the mouse in the foreleg. The mouse squealed. Ooh, doesn't that look scary? Look how big they are compared to the Littles. They're like big monsters, huh? Nuts, yelled Tom. I forgot. He shot another arrow. By that time, the mouse had climbed over the wall. As it struggled to its feet, the second arrow hit him in the rump. It squealed louder. The arrows didn't stop the mouse. It crawled toward the light. A low, snarling growl came from deep in its throat. Mr. Little stood his ground in the middle of the ceiling space, 4 feet away from the oncoming mouse. In one hand, he held the sword at arm's length, pointed at the mouse. In the other, he held the burning match high over his head like a torch. Then he lowered the torch and pointed it at the mouse. Suddenly, the mouse turned and limped away. Whew.